like to talk about sanding. The first thing I like to cover is sandpaper grit. When we look at sandpaper grit, it comes in numbers 80, 100, 120, 150, 180, 220, etc. What those numbers mean is how aggressive the sandpaper is. The lower the number, the more aggressive the sandpaper is, and the more aggressively it will remove material from the surface of your wood. Okay? And what you're doing is you're trying to prep the surface of the wood to accept our finish, whether it's stain, paint, oils, whatever. We're making the surface ready to do that. Okay. So if you take, for instance, 80 grit and you feel of it, it's going to have a bigger grit feel, bigger gritty feel to it than 120 or 220 or 180 or what have you, because the grits on the paper are larger. That's why the lower numbers leave behind bigger scratches in the surface of the wood. So when we go up in grit progression, we are removing those big scratches we just left behind and replacing them with smaller scratches that are more difficult to feel and makes the wood feel smoother to the touch. So 80 is a pretty aggressive grit to start with. You'll either start with 80 or 120. 120 is a medium grit. But we'll start with 80 for the sake of this video, okay? So you have imperfections in the wood. You want to kind of smooth it all out, level it all out. Go across it with your 80, all right? When you're sanding, you want to move no faster than about 1 inch per second if you're using an orbital or random orbital sander. If you're doing it by hand, you need to make sure that you're covering the area completely and you're not missing spots and you're going with the grain. With orbital and random orbital, doesn't matter so much. They're spinning around. Not a lot you can control on that, all right? Now, we'll assume for the rest of this video that you're using an orbital or random orbital sander, okay? The pressure you want to put on it should be no more than your hand resting on the sander to guide it. If you're pressing down, you're going to cause swirl marks within the grain that are going to show up really, really well when it comes time to apply your finish. So, have your grit, start at 80. Sanding, again, we're moving at about 1 inch per second, all right? It's going to feel slow, and that's why sanding is hated by so many people, because it's not a speedy process. I just kicked my tripod, sorry. But it's probably one of the most hated processes in all of woodworking. I personally love it. To me, it's the start of bringing out the true beauty of the wood. And if sanding isn't done correctly, you can completely ruin a whole project. So, back on topic though. We're at 80 grit. We're sanding using our orbital or random orbital, moving at the proper speed, okay? We cover the entire surface. Now, what's really important is that we clean our surface and prep it for the next grit. Because as I said, when you sand, you're leaving behind scratches. And you're also leaving behind a great deal of dust. And that dust gets into the pores and gets into those scratches that you're leaving behind. If you do not clean it out between grits, you're going to pack it down into the pores and you're going to pack it down into those scratches, and you'll never get those scratches removed. You're never going to get that dust removed, and you're going to have problems when you go to apply your stain because you're not going to get absorption, at least not even absorption, throughout the surface of the wood with either your stains, your oils, what have you. And it's just not going to look good. It's going to come out blotchy and just look terrible for the most part. So there's multiple ways that you can clean your surface to prep for the next level. The most common are a vacuum with a brush attachment and compressed air. Some people like to use mineral spirits and a lint-free cloth. Any of those methods is perfectly fine. For myself, I like to vacuum and then use compressed air to blow off any remaining dust that the vacuum didn't get, okay? Now, when you step up to that next level, you never want to go more than 50% of your current grit number. So if you're sitting at an 80 grit, you never want to increase by more than half of that, which is 40. So the highest grit you want to move to next is 120. Now you can go up to 100. That's perfectly fine. The most common is 80, 120, 180, 220. Some people prefer 80, 100, 150. 220, whatever floats your boat. It's going to be fine either way. Now, as I said, you move up 50%. I typically go from 80 to 120. I'll follow the same process, sanding, moving at about 1 inch per second. All right. Again, just resting my hand, letting the sander do the work. Clean the surface, move up again. Half of 120, 60. So the next one, 180. Now, depending on the type of finish that you're putting on your product, make sure you check the manufacturer recommendations. They will often list the maximum grit that you should go to in order to receive optimal results for that finish type. Some will say go to 150, some will say 180, 220, 320, what have you. The higher you go, the less absorption the surface of the wood is going to have, okay? Because once you get to a certain point, you're polishing the wood, all right? So you've gone up, you remove the scratches from the 80, you get up to 120, remove those scratches with your next grit. 180 removes the 120 scratches, replace them with smaller, etc., etc. All right. Once you get to your final grit, depending on the type of finish that you're putting on, if you're going to be putting on a top coat, this last step is not completely necessary. If you are going to be doing an oil-based, I find this step to be extremely important, especially for things like cutting boards or anything that you're just going to leave the natural feel of the wood, all right? And that's the water pop. Now, as I said, you're replacing the scratches you left behind with 80 by smaller scratches on your 120 with even smaller scratches on your 180, etc. However, you're never going to remove all of those scratches just by going through your progressions, all right? So what you want to do is either take a spray bottle after you've cleaned your surface, take a spray bottle, or my personal choice is a wet cloth that's lint-free, and wet the surface, all right? What that's going to cause is all those fibers that have been pushed down from those scratches are going to swell and raise up. After you wet the surface, if you run your hand across, you're going to think, man, that doesn't feel anything like what I just felt over there. And it's going to feel rough to the surface, rough to the touch, all right? Let that air dry. It usually takes 20, 30 minutes, depending on, ambient temperatures of the room and all that. After it's dried, use either the same grit or you can step up a little bit to the next level if you like. I like to use the same grit that I finished with, okay? So if I go up to 180, I'll use 180 for this. After you pop it, it's dried, do a very, very light sanding, okay? And this should be done by hand. Now, I never recommend anybody just put a piece of sandpaper in their hand and start rubbing around because you're going to leave behind marks. Your fingers are leaving indents. It's not going to do a great job. Either get a sanding block or just take a block of wood and wrap sandpaper around it and use that to lightly sand the surface. Once you do that, clean it. I like to go over it with a tack cloth. Research tack cloths. I'll cover those in another video. But that's going to get everything off of that surface, and it's now ready to receive your finish, whether it's oil, stain, paint, whatever. So hopefully this was information that was useful to you guys. And, as I said, I'll be covering some other things like, use of tack cloths, actually using different types of sanders, what the numbers on the sanders mean, things like that. But, if there's anything in particular you'd like me to cover, please drop a comment and, or send me a DM and say, hey, could you talk about this in another video? I'd be happy to do so. Thanks.